Well, Justin, it's good to have you down here at Stratford Hall, where I worked for many years, but we're down here at the Mill Pond. And Stratford's a Lee family home, and the mansion was built, as they called it, the Great House, in the late 1730s, early 1740s, and was the home of Thomas Lee, who was very influential in the colony. But Thomas, early on, bought this property, which had an old mill dam on it, and he built a water mill here in the early 1740s. And of course, the Lee family went on with their great role in the American Revolution with Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee. And I know you've been researching down here as well.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But 9-acre mill pond here, which feeds this water mill.
It's amazing.
And of course, we're going to grind a little today for what you're doing with your oven. But you've researched a lot of mills and bakers. So how does this fit in the context of what you've been doing?
I mean, this was a common thing in Virginia, all the way down stretching to South Carolina up into New England. You have windmills, tide mills, water wheel mills, and all that ties into the greater circle of baking, and it creates two trades. You know, tradesmen of today don't exist, and millers of that time period, you know, you had your millers and your bakers, and that sort of set the standard for wheat when it sort of took over from tobacco.
Yeah, because this tobacco built this plantation, obviously, and that was the cash crop. But being here on the river, the shipping, the commerce that went on down here, and the mill perfectly situated. So the Lees were part of that greater economic system that shipped to the Caribbean, brought back sugar, other goods, and also fed this local area. So we know, for instance, we'll go inside and take a look at one of the measures I have, but this mill served also as a small store, because records indicate they would sell pecks and half pecks of flour.
Right.
You know, so the local people would come here, get their grain ground, toll milling, where they would weigh it, keep a portion as payment, 1/6 or 1/8 of the grains, and fill it up, and move back home or to market. So this, if you rode your horse 5-6 miles in any direction back then, there's another mill.
Yeah.
But this is the only working one here in the northern neck, which is fascinating. So why don't we take a walk down toward the mill?
Yep. All right.
So we're in the mill now, obviously, and we're right by the millstones where all the mill furniture is around these stones. And this is basically a grain delivery system. In the hopper right now, we have an heirloom white llama wheat, which I know you bake with quite regularly. And this is to feed the grain in between these two millstones. So the grain's going to come out of the hopper, drop off of this tray. It's a V-shaped tray called the shoe, and that feeds it right into the center hole or the eye of the stone. What you can't see is there's two stones actually here. The top stone's going to rotate, powered by the wheel and water from the mill pond. The gears below will then turn to rotate this upper stone. There's another stone beneath it called the bedstone that's stationary, and between the two, the grain's ground. So once we get the mill going here in a few minutes, you'll be able to see that process. We'll go downstairs and see all that flour coming down the spout. But this is all basically how mills were for hundreds of years, this sort of delivery system. You also can see other equipment behind us, the stone crane, because periodically you have to lift this stone and clean it and sharpen it. And I think it might be good to take a look at the stone we have over here, talk a little more about the grains of the 18th century. And also how the stone looks at the grinding face of the stone. So why don't we just take a quick look at these over here.
All right.
Well, we just looked at the stones we're going to run in a few minutes, but this is another set of stones in the mill. And these are interesting because these are actually French burr stones. And the French burr stone was quarried as early as the 13th century, and they were imported into early America by the thousands, and they're freshwater quartz. They're very pitted, as you see, but it actually created air pockets to help cool that grain as it was grinding, and extra cutting surfaces. So if you were exporting flour in that time period, French burr stones is what you wanted to grind it on. And then you've got all these different heirloom grains that you've been working with right here. Maybe you could say a few things about those.
Yeah, you know, the Lees were growers of lots of grains in colonial South, and the same way with George Washington as well. And you know, to have a mill, you needed certain grains to grow, and these were the most popular ones in colonial Virginia. And you know, there's a variety of corns, just because corn was the staple in Virginia. And then as tobacco sort of faded out and wheat centered back in, You get a lot of different varieties of wheats. They were coming from all over. The white Lamasse, which we had over there, and the hopper is one of the bread wheats of the South. It's a soft wheat, but it's bread strength, so it makes a beautiful bread. And then we also have some varieties of barley, Scots Bear, which came over in the 18th century to colonial Virginia. And we also have some spelt, which they also grew here.
That goes way back.
And definitely milled. Spelt's one of the oldest grains in the world. And barley comes into play for brewing and distilling. Patrick Henry in the late 1790s was making a beverage out of probably Scots Bear barley to sort of cut down his intake of liquors and spirits.
Yeah, brewing was big in Virginia and in Pennsylvania, where you're originally from. And Washington loved porter beer, which you would get in Pennsylvania. But the distilling trade, too, was massive in rural America. So in Virginia, rye whiskey was very prevalent, but also corn whiskey. So a lot of these heirloom corns would have been utilized for that purpose. And I know the Lees here at Stratford had interest in the distillery.
Yeah.
So that's a story that hadn't been told a lot, but it'd be something they certainly engaged in.
And all these today are referred to as landrace varieties. Landrace being that they were improved upon selection over the years from indigenous peoples and from settlements that moved there and grew in the region. So a lot of these corns are of the Flint variety. A lot of corns now are dent, not referring to like corn as sweet corn, but referring to corn in general for like grits or cornbread. Dent corn is what you're seeing most likely today, and Flints are a little earlier. And gourd seed, which grew in Virginia and the Carolinas, those were actually crossed with Flints to make dent corn.
It's interesting, the flavor profiles I know from distilling and brewing, when you use the modern grains, and I'm sure with your baking, there's just it's a different flavor profile that comes through.
Oh, it's
from
unbelievable.
These earlier grains, It's
unbelievable. And the caramelization of the natural sugars coming out in the bread to make it that nice golden brown color. And we'll check on some things I have baking in the oven later. And it what provides all these. And common bread was a staple of every day, and that kind of functioned through all the way down to enslaved workers all the way up to the top, in different varieties and different and milling styles and fineness.
It's interesting because we know from the records here that there was an enslaved man named James that was listed as working at the mill, and a woman that was referenced as Bab at the mill. So all these plantations had people that worked in the fields, but also a number of skilled craftsmen that were African American. So I know down here at the landing, they had an African American who was a shipwright. So we have the mill today, but this was a complex of buildings in the 18th century.
Right.
And as you said, tobacco built the profit, but without these, you can't subsist.
Yeah.
So why don't we go ahead and run the stone?
Yeah, let's run it.
All right. First, I want to gap the stone. And we're going to give her some water. Now we're outside by Justin's oven, and the milling has been done, so it's really all about what you do here with the ground products and what you make in the oven.
Yeah,
So,
we're bringing everything full circle. These loaves were made in this oven. This is a clay oven, typical style of the colonial South and even up into New England. Mainly structured from clay and a little bit of quick mortar lime. And basically the process of it is heating it up, getting it as hot as possible, then pulling everything out, and then you can bake your bread. These loaves were baked from spelt, which is one of the grains we viewed earlier, and then we also have the white lamasse wheat in here. And then there's some wheat chisel in here as well, which is the bran that's folded back into the bread afterwards. And it was also sold as, some people pass it as household flour. So that's all baked in this beautiful loaf of bread. And I think we might cut this open and see what it looks like inside.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
We're inside the mill, but as a baker, what can you speak to the modern grains versus what you're working with here and how that lends itself to the things you create?
Yeah, I think basically, you know, and this goes in the same way with the milling too. You're talking about the coldness of the stones, kind of the closeness, too close, you know, it gets that warmth and it kind of scorches the flour. Well, the colder process, you know, the more the flour, when it travels, it doesn't, you know, it's not alive, it's not dead. It's almost active. And the flavor properties, even in this one, you can see the caramelization, and that's coming from the spelt and the wheat chisel. It's bringing like the natural sugars out of it during fermentation, and then when it's in the oven, the first, you know, 30 or 40 minutes, it's kind of almost self-steaming, and then the last 10 minutes, all that steam that's risen inside has coated the top of the oven, and it almost comes back down and cloaks these loaves, and it creates a lovely crispness to it, and that nice Maillard reaction, basically, the caramelization coming out in the dough. And the flavors are just, they're so different. They're not comparable. And I think with baking with these grains, you have to also bake it the way they did, and you have to hand mix it like they did, and you have to rise it. No cold fermentation here, no 24 hours sitting in a refrigerator. Yeah, it's just better bread.
Well, you've got your dough box over there, and that's actually an 18th century piece, right?
Yep, it is.
So maybe you'd talk a little bit about what the preparation you go through to get the loaves in the oven.
So you can see remnants of this dough, which actually will stay in this box. This dough bowl in particular, you can see it's got the handle back here. It's actually got a plugged hole with copper. And you basically fill it with water, enough that flour would absorb it. 40 to 50% is what the 18th century of hydration level. So water to flour ratio. And water would sit in there, and you would add a beer barm or like an ale yeast. And then the next day you would let this sit, these little pieces, these little specks of dough, and you would add your water, and that would act as almost like a starter, like a sourdough starter, but not in that style. And then it's mixed together until the bread comes together, and then it rises for 30 to 40 minutes, and then it ferments for about 2 hours. And in that is bringing out all those reactions of the flour and the spelt and the grain that'll cause that caramelization later in the oven. And then they also had dough boxes, which had lids, removable lids, and it's done the same way. The bread's mixed the same way. But this is kind of key right here, the remnants of that dough, to leave it in there day after day, because when you were baking it, some of it was done every day. Some people baked once for the whole entire week, but most people it was every day. It was a daily thing. So this would be left in for later use for the next day.
When we make whiskey or beer, which we've done together, you know, that starter for the next batch. We do a sweet mash, but the sour mash process with whiskey was the same process,
right?
Of, you know, making the next fermentation. So incredibly interesting, and you know, learned a lot from you over the last year as we've worked together, and it's great to be down here at Stratford at another mill, because these things are all connected. The commerce, the people that lived and worked here, the accurate tools of the trades, and we forget, without these people making bread and growing grains, whatever commerce was ongoing did not happen. So you got to eat. And the nice thing about flour we didn't get too much into is also as a commodity. It was sold throughout Caribbean and back to Europe as well. So as we always know, we talk a long time, but this is just part of the story.
It is.
And I think there's more that we can do. And the good news is now we get to eat all this great bread.
We do.
Yeah.